Okay, welcome everybody to this final session of our Relevance Researchers Network Conference 2. And we have our second plenary with Anne Bezuidenhout, who is Professor of Linguistics at the University of South Carolina, where she's a core member of the Linguistics Program and an affiliated member of the Institute of Mind and Brain. She works in philosophy of language and on topics at the semantics-pragmatics interface, with a diverse research profile employing both formal and experimental methods, and has contributed to knowledge and debates in areas including reference, presupposition, and intentions. Until recently, Anne was also editor-in-chief of the Journal of Pragmatics and has been a key contributor, supporter, and friend of the Relevance Researchers Network. So we're extremely pleased to welcome her as our second plenary speaker today and to close our conference. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Anne, who's going to present today a talk titled Intentions in Referential Communication.
Thank you so much. Thanks very much, Kate, and thank you very much to Kate and Royka for, first of all, for organizing this network, which I think is really great. I love participating in it, and of course the two conferences that they've organized. And thank you very much for the invitation. So roadmap for this talk, I intend to defend the claim that the recognition of speaker intentions is crucial for coordination in referential communication. And I'm going to do this by examining two anti-speaker intention arguments from Chris Garker's paper in 2019. These two arguments he calls the circularity argument and the psychological burden argument. And my critiques of these two arguments, I hope, will allow me to outline views about the relationship between actions and the mental state complexes that there are their reasons and causes, and allow me to say something about the role of perspective taking and joint attention in referential communication. Having done that, I will then move to use this conception of action and intention that I've articulated to address certain arguments that are circulating in the literature these days that downplay the role of speaker intentions and try to emphasize the way that we give off social meanings that others can exploit in conversation. So to begin then with the Garker, the critique of Garker's arguments. He runs with a consistent example throughout his whole paper, so let me just get that example out first of all. He asks us to imagine that he and a companion are at a restaurant and he notices that his companion's fork is dirty. So he utters the sentence, "that is dirty," intending to refer to the companion's fork. However, just as he utters this sentence, for some reason his gaze falls on his own fork, which is spotlessly clean. And his intuition is that he succeeded in referring to the clean fork with his expression "that" and saying something false, and he thinks everybody would agree with this intuition, whereas the speaker intention view has to say that what Garker said is true, since he intended to refer to the dirty fork. Or at best, this view can say it's just the utterance was not truth valuable because the intentions were the referential intentions were opaque. So problems right out of the gate. First of all, Garker says nothing about where the listener's attention is at the time of the utterance. So is the demonstrative being used to mark something that's already in joint attention, or is it as a device for establishing joint attention? Secondly, he says nothing about why he chose the distal demonstrative "that" as opposed to "this," and I'll come back to that point later on. And thirdly, he never even considers what happens in a dialogue where speakers take turns at talk. He's just uttered this sentence allegedly in a context, but nothing ensues. So the next two slides, I'm going to present some cases. This is not with referring to demonstratives, with referring with names that are discussed by Mandy Simons in her critique of the conventionalist picture of the conversational scoreboard that Ernie Lepore and Matthew Stone have proposed. However, these examples are helpful in illustrating an interactive view of referential communication that I think is the right one to hold.
Oh, we've lost your sound, I think.
Can you
You're
hear me
back.
now?
Yes, I don't know what happened there. Maybe it's just me.
Okay. It does say my internet connection is unstable. Can you hear
Ah,
me?
okay. Yes, you're back now. Thanks.
Okay. So she's having a conversation with her father, who frequently mixes up the names of his two grandsons, Simon's son and her nephew. Nevertheless, the father is perfectly well able to distinguish these two grandchildren. He knows the different activities that they're involved in. So he intends to be talking about Simon's son, but he initially misnames him before going on to mention some fact that's only true of Simon's son and not her nephew, confirming that he has the son in mind and not the nephew. At the point of this misnaming, Simon's had various options open to her. She could have pointed out that her father misused the name of her nephew to talk about her son, or she could tease her father by taking him to be referring to the nephew and then acting all surprised that her nephew is now doing the same things as her son. Or she could do what she did, which was just go with the flow and recognize that it was a slip of the tongue and that the conversation was, after all, about her son. So this was not a series, the father's comments were not a series of false comments about the nephew, but a series of true comments about the son. I'm going to skip over this second example in the interest of time. But I think you can work with those two different examples, the fork example and the grandfather example, as two opposing views of what conversation is all about. But getting now back to the circularity argument that Garker raises against the speaker intention view, he says that the speaker intention view is forced to give an account of the content of the intention in terms of the referential act that it's meant to explain, which of course would be hopelessly circular. So the gist of my reply, which is going to be developed over the next several slides, is that, first of all, Garker has things reversed. In fact, it's the action that inherits its representational content or its aboutness properties from the belief, desire, intention complex, which is its reason or cause. And we should also reject any suggestion that intentions are somehow hidden, private mental states that the audience can only guess at. So to make my case, let me start first of all with a non-linguistic case. Suppose you want to turn on a light and you believe that the light is controlled by a wall switch that you see in front of you. So you form the intention to flip the switch. An intention is an action plan, and accordingly, and so ordinarily it would include sub-plans and sub-sub-plans all the way down to steps that can be immediately executed. So in the switch flipping case, the plan will include one to extend your arm towards the location of the switch on the wall, shape your index finger, say, in a way that will engage the switch, and then move your finger upward, exerting enough but not too much pressure on the switch to move it into its on position. Much of this planning, of course, is handled subconsciously by circuits in the motor cortex, sending signals to your muscles to get them to flex in suitable ways. And in the execution of these movements, there must be some kind of feedback loop, for instance, involving the dorsal visual pathway that is responsible for guiding bodily movements so that your target is achieved. The action is a switch flipping precisely because it has this etiology. And to explain or give a reason for the action, one would advert to this belief, desire, intention complex that was its cause. The basic action here is the flipping of the light switch. And by doing this, you may or may not succeed in turning on the light, which was one of your further goals. And that, of course, you don't have control over because that will depend on such things as whether the bulb is functioning, whether the wiring between the switch and the light socket is intact, and so on. And by turning on the light, you may also thereby illuminate the room, startle the burglar who's creeping through the room, and so on. Very similarly, in the linguistic case, referring to an object with a demonstrative like that in some context C, a speaker wants to warn, wants to warn his companion about the dirty fork, and he believes that by drawing his companion's attention to the fork, he will then be able to issue such a warning. The speaker knows as part of his linguistic competence that demonstratives can be used exophorically in situations where interlocutors are co-present and where the use of eye gaze or bodily gestures can be recruited to help bring an object into the joint attention of the interlocutors. And furthermore, the speaker believes he's currently in such a situation, so he informs the intention of using the demonstrative that to refer to the dirty fork. This intention is an action plan that consists of sub-plans, sub-sub-plans, all the way down to levels of steps that can be directly executed. Much of the unfolding of this plan will be handled by processes below the level of conscious awareness, but crucially, I think will also involve feedback loops. Here I'm sort of just glossing over things because the processes are very complex. The action then will be referring to this object by means of the demonstrative precisely because it has this etiology. To explain or give a reason for this referring action, one would advert to the belief, desire, intention complex that it was its cause. The referential action inherits its representational content from the contents of the mental state complex that is its cause. And the mental states in this complex, in turn, in other words, the belief about the dirty fork, the desire to bring it to the audience's attention, the intention to refer to it by means of a demonstrative expression of that, these in turn get their contents from the causal intentional relations holding between those mental states and objects in the world. And here I realize I'm glossing over a huge problem. It's the problem of intentionality. And here you have to just substitute your preferred solution to this problem in order to understand how this would work. In the situation that Garker imagines, however, something goes awry in the speaker's plan. He doesn't actually say what caused it, but let me just specify that it's a sudden neck spasm that causes his head to turn away from the intended target, which was his companion's dirty fork, and at the last moment, his neck jerks and his gaze falls on the clean fork instead, perhaps leading those co-present to assume that the clean fork is the intended target. However, I've already mentioned that this error is in principle detectable as the conversational exchange proceeds, because in the same way that in the Simons case, where the conversation goes on and you have various choices to figure out what was the intended target. But when the plan goes awry in this way, are we forced to say that the referent of that is the clean fork, as Gauker wants to say? So think again of a switch flipping case. The planning there could also go awry. So just as my index finger approaches the light switch, a sudden muscle spasm forces my arm to move to the side, and I end up flipping the fire alarm switch, which is next to the light switch. Wouldn't it be natural to say in this case that I flipped the alarm switch and hence, of course, turned on the alarm, albeit unintentionally? And so likewise, Gauker referred to the clean fork by his use of that, albeit unintentionally. So isn't my account flawed? My reply is no, because joint attention must be achieved for successful reference, and that was not achieved in the scenario where Gauker's eyes were suddenly moved because of some uncontrolled jerk. The speaker's gaze was uncontrolled, and hence it didn't have a target. Just for instance, when I have an arm spasm and that causes me to hit you, you were not the target of the spasm. You just happened to intersect the trajectory of my arm. So in this case, the referring case is not entirely parallel to the switch flipping case. Because the arm spasm resulted in my turning on the alarm, really turning on the alarm. Really flipping the switch, should I say, because that's the basic action. The difference is that in the referring case, joint attention, which is an interactional achievement, is required, even for the basic action of referring to X using the demonstrative that. Whereas in the switch flipping case, all that was needed was some physical motion of some sort. It happened to be my arm, but it could have been something completely non-human that did that. So Gauker's circularity charge fails. And I think partly is because he doesn't realize that we don't explain the content of the intention by appealing to the content of the action, but rather the reverse. The action inherits its content from the mental state cluster that is its reason or explanation. The second argument that he presents is this psychological burden argument. He says that the speaker intention view is posits a psychologically burdensome experience for both the speaker and the hearer. The hearer must track the speaker intentions, and he calls this the mind to meaning inference, which is illustrated by this little diagram on the left of the screen. So a hearer would have to rely on external factors in order to draw an inference about the speaker's intentions, and only then draw an inference about what the speaker was referring to. And from the speaker's end, the speaker has to monitor the audience's thoughts about these intentions. In other words, the speaker has to engage in audience design in order to make sure that they're all tracking the same thing, and that is just burdensome. Garker thinks instead that the process is as follows. All that the speaker and the hearer are relying on are external factors, which he calls the meaning to mind inference. So the listener in particular is going to take information from the external context and use that to draw an inference about what the demonstrative refers to, and only secondarily, if at all, draw any inferences about the speaker's intentions. So the speaker's intentions become like a fifth wheel not doing any kind of real work. And with respect to this idea that speakers engage in audience design, Garker basically thinks that there's no introspective evidence that we engage in such processes at all. He says it's much more plausible that speakers conceive of themselves as trying, for a given object of potential reference, to utter the demonstrative that in such a way, under such circumstances, that it really does refer to that object. In other words, they don't care about whether the hearer can make the inferences. They just have the responsibility of making sure that their utterance really does refer. Well, what are these external factors that Garker has in mind? He mentions the following: observations of the prior discourse to which the speaker's utterance is a contribution, observations of the speaker's non-linguistic behavior, by which I think he means things like pointing, gestures, eye gaze, and so on, and then observation of what's going on in the current environment, including the non-linguistic behavior of the other interlocutors. Frankly, I don't think he can really appeal to one, because that supposes that the interlocutors already succeeded in their referential communications. And if the question is whether such referential communication requires awareness of speakers' intentions, then you can't just assume that you've already you already have successful communication. The question then is whether he has an account that allows him to give an account of demonstrative reference relying just on these external observations. He doesn't mention linguistic conventions, but I assume that he would be perfectly happy to add shared knowledge of such conventions to the external factors that the audience has access to. So what are my replies to this argument? So starting with the speaker, what would it mean to, he says that the speaker just has to utter that in such a way, under such circumstances, that it really does refer to that object. Well, what does this involve? So I think, first of all, the rule for the exophoric use of the demonstrative that, as opposed to this, in English at least, is that it should be used to refer to a contextually salient object that is distal to the speaker and either proximal to the audience or distal to both the speaker and the audience. So in this little diagram on the right-hand side, this would be the C and D cases. Either proximal to that is appropriate when the object is either proximal to the hearer or distal to both speaker and hearer. So the speaker needs to figure out then what is the relative perspectives of the interlocutors and to make some judgment about relative and perhaps comparative salience, because maybe there's more than one salient object in the context. So you have to say you have to figure out what is the most salient given the conversational purposes. If the partner's fork had already been a topic of conversation or had just been picked up by the hearer, that would be a judgment. You could then make a judgment that the object was salient to the speaker. However, if the fork is a new topic, then Garker has to somehow make the object salient by redirecting the audience's attention. All of this requires monitoring the interlocutor's gaze, and while it needn't involve complex mind reading, it is definitely a form of perspective monitoring and requires at least triadic engagement between the speaker, the audience, and the object, if not even more sophisticated collaborative engagement. The audience, too, has access to these rules for the exophoric use of demonstratives. And if the audience does briefly entertain the idea that Garker intends to refer to the clean fork because his gaze landed on the clean fork, it should seem strange to them that he didn't use this, because the clean fork is right in front of him. And generally, the speaker should use this if they're referring to something that's proximal to the speaker. So his partner's dirty fork is distal, and that's what warrants the use. That would warrant the use of that. So the audience should be pretty confused, and if this was an ordinary conversation, that's the point at which the audience would seek clarifications. Moreover, if the audience's attention had been on Garker's clean fork prior to his utterance, then hearing him say that is dirty, they would have construed that as a signal for them to look at an object farther away from the speaker. This last point is based on some recent experimental work by Rubia Fernandez and her colleagues, which we can talk about in the Q&A. So basically, I don't think Garker has shown us that he has a way of getting to the referent of a demonstrative that does not involve some kind of mind reading. But implicit in his argument, I guess, is that speaker intentions are OTOs, and implicit in his argument that they are OTOs is his conviction that external factors can get us everything we need, part of which I've partly tried to argue is not the case. But he might then invoke this notion of a convention and say, well, okay, it's conventions that work to get us all the way. A similar thought underlies some recent work by Hansen and Turkarafi, where they try to argue that speaker intentions are irrelevant, and they give the following example from Peter Strawson's paper on intentionality and intentions and conventions. Strawson mentions this example of somebody in a bridge game unintentionally redoubling. So a player might let slip the word redouble without meaning to redouble. But if the circumstances are appropriate and the play is strict, then he has redoubled, or he may be held to have redoubled. And so Hansen and Turkarafi think that this is clear evidence that speaker intentions are irrelevant and conventions are the only things that determine what was said, or what was referred to, or whatever. However, Strawson goes on immediately after this quote to say, but a player who continually did this sort of thing would not be asked to play again except by sharpers. Forms can take charge in the absence of appropriate intention, but when they do, the case is essentially deviant or non-standard. There is present in the standard case, that is to say, the same element of wholly overt and avowable intention as in the case of the act not essentially conventional. So if you are meaning to play, even in a game like bridge, which is a highly conventionalized game with strict rules, intentions are playing a crucial role. Moving on then to a more general critique of this idea that speaker intentions are irrelevant, there is a popular idea against the speaker intention view that points to all the social cues that we unintentionally give off during verbal exchanges. So we give off information about ourselves, such as whether we are native speakers of a language, for instance, by speaking with an accent, about what our state of health is, by speaking in a hoarse voice, and whether we are tired or bored by speaking listlessly. These, of course, are social cues unintentionally carried by the spoken words, but they're also social cues we give off via our bodily behavior by means of facial expressions, yawns, gestures, and so on that might accompany the stream of speech. I claim that when these are non-intentional, they don't belong to the study of verbal communication proper. Of course, they can be exploited intentionally because someone, for instance, could deliberately put on an accent in order to get the audience to do something or to believe something. But generally speaking, if they're unintentional, then they're not part of verbal communication. Cues that are unintentionally given off by the speaker are often exploited, I do agree, by audiences in conversational exchanges. However, when you focus on non-intentional bits of behavior of your interlocutors, you are basically objectifying them and treating them rather than treating them as an agent. This would explain, for instance, why people who are asked where you're from, because the questioner has detected an accent, frequently find the question to be hostile and othering. Communicative acts belong to the realm of reasons, and hence are constitutively connected to the mental state complex that give rise to them, to the belief, desire, intention complexes, which are their reasons and causes. By the way, this idea of this distinction between objectifying people or treating them as agents comes from an essay by P.F. Strawson called Freedom and Resentment, where he makes a distinction between objective and reactive attitudes. So when you take an objective attitude towards somebody, you're treating them basically as a body that can only be managed or handled as a non-reasoning entity. Whereas when you treat somebody from this reactive point of view, you're treating them as an agent that has reasons that can be either engaged with or contradicted or in some other way treated as somebody who has some contribution to make to the exchange. So unintentional cues, I say, don't belong to this realm of reactive attitudes. But you might say, aren't there cases where the speaker's intentions are totally irrelevant, such as when we feel the need to call someone out for mansplaining or for being a misogynist? Yes, I agree, but this is because sometimes we're taking this objectifying attitude may be warranted. So the person that you called out as being a mansplainer or a misogynist may very well object that that wasn't their intention. And, they might say, oh, I didn't intend to be rude, or I didn't intend to mansplain. And perhaps even they were speaking in a very polite way, so not trying to be offensive. Nevertheless, if you call them out, you are overriding their intentions and focusing on their mansplaining behavior. Then this is treating them as somebody who needs handling in a way other than as a rational agent, perhaps as somebody suffering from a form of motivated irrationality, which is a concept from David Pears. Basically, the idea of motivated irrationality is somebody who refuses to have evidence or sort of compartmentalizes information or evidence that they find unacceptable in a way that doesn't allow them to update their beliefs. So perhaps a misogynist who doesn't take the information about, the contributions of women to society seriously, or puts it off to the side and doesn't allow it to change their beliefs, that kind of person will be suffering from motivated irrationality. And maybe that is the way to treat these people, rather than as agents. However, I think in other cases, like Trump's endless stream of misogynistic statements, we should not allow him to get away with "that wasn't my intention" defense. He is an intentional misogynist, and he should be treated as an agent and held accountable for his actions. And the last point I want to make is about whether it's possible to recognize something as an action without recognizing the agent's intentions. And I'm going to say no. You certainly can recognize something as belonging to the class of actions, i.e. intentionally produced behaviors, without being able to say exactly what that action was. So for instance, if I see you crawling around on all fours, I think you must be doing that intentionally, but I can't figure out your reasons. So I do think you engage in an action rather than a mere bodily behavior. For instance, you do seem to have control over your limbs, but I won't be able to see this as an action until I can see that you are, or understand that you are searching for a fallen contact lens. And this supposes that I understand that you believe your contact lens was on the floor, that you wanted to retrieve it, that you believe getting down on all fours would put you in a better position to find the fallen lens, and that therefore you formed the intention to get down on all fours and start searching. Similarly, I would say in the realm of communicative actions, you could likewise recognize something as belonging to the class of ostensive acts without being able to say what action was performed, because you lack information about the communicator's intentions. But you couldn't say what the act was. So if I see somebody in the distance with their hands cupped to their mouth, but I can't make out any words from this distance, then I think you must be doing it intentionally. You're not merely going through a series of bodily routines as if controlled by an invisible puppeteer. Nevertheless, I don't know what your action is until I can get closer and hear your actual words and learn more about the situations. I could perhaps in that case figure out that the speaker, for instance, is warning his audience about some danger. On the other hand, inasmuch as I'm an overhearer rather than a ratified member of the audience, I might not be privy to the information that is needed to resolve the referent. So basically, you do need to have information about the belief, desire, intention complex, both in the case of non-linguistic actions and in ostensive acts, in order to figure out what act is being performed. And so speaker intentions play a crucial role. Identifying speakers' intentions play a crucial role here. So basically, to recognize an action as one of referring to an object by means of an expression is to be able to identify its reason or cause, namely the belief, desire, intention complex that brought it about. Recognition of a speaker's intentions is crucial for coordinating in referential communication and for achieving joint attention needed for successful reference. This sort of coordination is needed even in cases where some of the interlocutors are non-cooperative, or in the cases where we are engaged in an antagonistic or a competitive situation. And this is because you can't verbally deceive me or about some object, or disagree with me about some object, unless we agree that we are talking about that object. Otherwise, we're just talking past each other. So crucially, intentions are not hidden inside the speaker's head. They are displayed in the speaker's acts of referential communication. The actions are constitutively connected to their reasons and displayed in the actions. Offensive speech can be treated from an objective point of view, but it's preferable to hold speakers accountable for their actions and for the intentions displayed in their actions, especially if these actions are done repeatedly, because actions speak louder than words, so the adage goes. And then finally, if cues are given off unintentionally, exploiting them in conversation risks treating your interlocutor from an objective rather than a reactive point of view, as a body rather than an agent. Okay, I haven't been able to, the attacks on the speaker intention view are prevalent in current debates, and there are many, many lines of reasoning that I haven't been able to address in this talk and that would need to be addressed. For instance, Hansen and Turkorafi have argued that an appeal to speaker intentions is Western-centric, and that other cultures, quote, operate under the doctrine that other minds are essentially opaque, unquote, which of course is just the complete opposite of what I've been arguing, because intentions, I think, are completely out in the open. They're displayed in action. And another one of Hansen and Turkorafi's arguments is that we can communicate perfectly well with chatbots, but we don't attribute intentions to them. Of course, in this talk, I was concerned with the exophoric use of referring expressions, such as demonstratives like this and that, and that wouldn't be relevant to our online interactions with chatbots, since we don't share our perceptual environment with them, so the use of exophoric demonstratives is not relevant in this case. However, it would be interesting in the future to look at a wider set of uses of demonstratives, such as anaphoric uses and uses of demonstratives in contexts other than the dialogic ones that I've discussed here, such as in soliloquy, public speech, and non-fictional prose. Because just as exophoric demonstratives allow us to keep track of objects in the physical environment, anaphoric uses are allowing us to keep track of things in our cognitive environment. And I think we could ask about whether intentions play a role there as well. Speaker intentions play a role there as well. And that is it. I have no more. Let's see, how much did I time? I don't know what time I took. Probably longer than 26 minutes.
But perfectly within the time, perfectly within the time that allocated. Thank you very much.
Okay.
So for the last time today, I will open the floor to questions. Camera's gone on, people formulating their questions. Robin.
Working slowly, so I try to switch on the video. It doesn't come on, so I try to switch it on again, and that switches it off. Anyway, thank you, Anne. I thought that was fabulous, and I completely agree. Completely, 100% agree. So I don't really have much by way of a question, but just a teensy-weensy point about the demonstratives, this and that. So it just occurred to me when you're talking about this dirty fork case, suppose a slightly different case where, and this isn't going to be anything to do with a miscommunication or anything like that, but suppose that the waiter brings our food and puts yours down in front of you and mine down in front of me, and I look at mine and I say, that looks disgusting. That. Now, I think that's fine, even though I'm referring to the one that's proximal, as it were. It's something to do, isn't it, with trying to create a distance between me and this plate of food. So, you know, this is, as I say, it's a tiny, tiny point, but I just think that perhaps the interpretation of this and that is a little bit more tricky and fine-grained than the sort of simple proximal distal thing.
Right. Yeah, and that I would be really happy to take on board, that it would be more complex. The point, and I don't think you're denying this, is that it does involve some paying attention to the other people in the exchange. It's not an egocentric thing. You're not determining whether you're using this or that from a purely egocentric point of view. You have to be
yeah, I think that
you have to be monitoring, or
yeah.
maybe denying
I mean,
maybe
again, I
denying
mean, sorry, my eye gaze would probably be, you know, looking, and my whole face looking in sort of horror, disgust, or something or other at this plate of food which is stuck in front of me, very proximal to me. So if I was, I don't know, if I was gazing at your plate of food and I said that, then, you know, there's an interaction of these cues, isn't there? And
So
in
in the
order
case
to,
of that you imagined, where you said that is discussing about your own food,
yeah, that
were you
was my
thinking
example for you.
were you thinking of it as an entirely egocentric reaction? I mean, are you trying to use this
Well,
as
no,
a
I'm communicating with you across the table. But I guess my primary intention is, you know, is sort of a sudden reaction to this thing that I don't like. And I was just wondering if that usage of that is still pretty much in line with what you were saying about the proximal distal thing, but it's sort of creating creating a distance between me and the thing.
Right.
So this is not a big point. I mean, you know, just no one had their hand up, so I thought, well, I'll just mention it because it did cross my mind. Because I have to say, yeah, I'm 100% with everything you said.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know whether this is a related thing, but yes, I mean, I think that is actually quite complicated also by the relative distances between, or the relative sizes of the things that you're referring to. So this is an example I got from, I've just been teaching a course on Introduction to Language Sciences using language files, and this is an example that they use, which is kind of cute. Suppose you and I are standing, say, you know, 3 yards in front of a big skyscraper. I could say, this is huge, and you'd understand me to be referring to the skyscraper. But if there's a fly on the wall, also on which is also the very same distance away from us,
Yes.
you would probably have to say
Yes.
that is small, or that is dirty, or whatever. So
Right. You
if
see what
this
you mean. Okay, so
fly
it's not
is
just, it's
tiny
not
and the
pure
skyscraper,
distance.
right?
Yeah.
You've
Okay.
got to
Yeah. That
make
is relevant. I mean, so there is a range of factors coming in to this selection of this or that in any given instance. I mean, it makes no difference to your points, but
right. So yeah, I mean, what counts as distal could vary depending on the referent, and you've brought in these other sort of evaluative aspects as well.
yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
If I could chip in, I did look at this and that in my PhD and in my monograph that followed up from that. And yeah, absolutely, there's these kind of emotional distances or metaphorical proximal distances, and I present a procedural analysis of it in that but also that kind of contrast between something I want that to be further away rather than close to me.
Right. And then, of
Yeah.
course, there are all those uses like, you know, I came that close to hitting him in the face.
Yeah.
What-
Yeah. And also it's very complicated, as you say. Very
So I
subtle.
guess for the point of the view of this talk, I was just trying to bring in the idea that you have to look at, you can't just rely on non-mental things. You've got to also bring in some consideration about your interlocutor's mental states. But I mean, I think people have made a quite convincing case that this is some of this recent work that Rubio Fernandez has been doing, depending on whether you've got jointly attending or not. You have to use this or that. And anaphoric uses are the same, although there this thing is the informational asymmetry. between the two, between the speaker and the hearer. So you do have to be tracking who's got information about what, where are people looking, what are they doing.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Agnieszka.
Yes, thank you so much. Actually, I would like to share a comment which is maybe a bit tangential to your main point, but when you mentioned this paper by Terkurafi and Hansen, so I just thought immediately, because actually this, I think that there, or at least Marina Terkurafi's agenda was primarily politeness studies, and the idea of focusing on convention, it was very often emphasized in her papers or in papers by Michael Haw. But I think that so much as I believe that their observations are spot on with respect to the role of conventions in expressing politeness, they are not really to be like generalized just like that over to so just this tiny comment.
Yes, that's a very fair point. It's maybe a little unfair to Marina to construe her as saying things about demonstratives when she was talking about situations that seem more in line with politeness things. Although she does give, she is the one that gives the example about mansplaining, where we're perfectly, where it doesn't matter what the speaker thinks. It's the hearer's reaction that counts. Yeah. Stavros?
No, just to build up on this. Thank you so much. This was really interesting and a lot to think about. If I may, I want to repeat one thing that was asked to you, Kate, in your talk. Like, how would you deal with dog whistling in this type of thing, where you get like a purely referential thing, and then you also get an extra meaning on top of that?
Yeah, well, I should say that I didn't maybe emphasize this. I'm not saying that all acts of referential communication are always successful. Of course, you can be unsuccessful in your
But the success in the case of
in figuring out what action has been performed. So this, I think, would be happening. So the naive person who takes the dog whistler to be making, some generic comment about something perfectly ordinary has actually misunderstood the communication.
Okay.
I mean, because the intended audience was the people who know the code.
Yeah, but at the same time, I mean, a lot of the discourse we're hearing right now, especially in politics, is sort of dog whistling in a way, right? I mean, they've baptized like the woke agenda and and all this stuff.
Right. So, well, then it's not really dog whistling anymore, because we all know that.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. No, you're right. Thank you.
And yeah, I agree, because that's why these days these people can't get away with it, because we all know that it's no longer a code for their racist comments. Their racist other comments are so on the surface now that I don't think they can get away with it.
Yeah, but at the same time, they're not committing themselves to the bad stuff, to the connotations. So they can get away with it in a way, right? But yeah, but this is a different discussion altogether. Thanks.
Right.
Any other comments or questions?
Sure, there's some people who are dying to get to bed.
Well, there's no other hands go up. Then we'll just thank Anne once again. Thank you, fascinating.
And thank you so much, Kate, and Royko for organizing this. This was really a wonderful experience. I'm sure everybody agrees.
I'm just going to say a few words.
The whole thing.
I'm just going to say a few words just to wrap things up. I won't keep people more than a minute or two, I promise, because it has been a long morning, day, evening for all of you. But thank you. There's a wonderful way to close the day with that presentation. And thanks also to Tim Wharton, who opened the day with his plenary. Just wanted to make a quick announcement on behalf of Agnieszka Piskorska, who is running a Relevance Theoretic Conference in Warsaw on the 11th and 12th of December this year. She says the central theme is the interplay of propositional and non-propositional effects in various discourses, but contributors can contribute on other topics as well. And the plenary speakers there are Louis de Saussure and Francisco Yus. So that a call will be circulated shortly, but we thought this was a great audience to promote that too. So keep a lookout for that call coming soon. And then secondly, just to thank all of the speakers today, and a special thank you to all of you who chaired a session. We really couldn't have run the day without you. Roke and I were managing a million different screens, and having people to look after sessions really, really helped us out. So thank you. We really appreciate your help. And finally, thank you to everybody who participated today, whether speaking or just coming along, observing and asking questions. Thank you to those of you who got up really early to join us or who are staying up very late into the night. There's no perfect time to run this, so we appreciate your efforts. We love running this network, but it's only as strong as the membership, and we're really overwhelmed by the positive responses that we've had to it so far and to the activities that we've run. Please get in touch if you would like to run an event through the network. That could be giving a talk. It could be putting together a special interest group. If you gave a talk today and you'd like a bit more time to explore those ideas or the next iteration of them, or to answer more questions, then we can schedule a dedicated session for you. And we would also love the network to start to underpin and support some larger projects in the future. And we're looking into ways that we can do that. We hope to be back with another conference in 2 years' time, but do look out for any other activities and initiatives. We'll be updating our mailing list with those of you who've opted in after this session, so we should keep you up to date. Thank you all once again on behalf of myself and Ryoko. Thank you, and yeah, enjoy the rest of your morning, noon, or night, depending on where you are. And we will close the day with that. Thank you once again.
Thank you. Bye.